Hello. A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens, and certainly a writer and a story that needs little by way of introduction. And whenever anybody says that, it means, of course, that they're about to offer an introduction, and I will briefly. Dickens and his writings have been a lifelong love for me. I inherited it very much from my dad, and he had pretty much the entire library of Dickens, which I devoured as I went along. I think I read David Copperfield in its entirety when I was about 10, and I worked my way manfully, or should I say boyfully, through the whole thing. It's long, and I think if you'd asked me by the time I was reaching the end of it what had happened in the first half of it, I may have struggled for details, but I got there in the end, and the love of Dickens and his writing has never left me. I think it was George Bernard Shaw who described him as the greatest English playwright who never wrote a play. And I was lucky enough to be in a theatrical adaptation of one of Dickens' novels, Hard Times, in the 1980s. And I understood absolutely what Shaw meant. Not only is his dialogue so wonderful to speak, but I noticed that Dickens, who was himself an actor and a playwright, particularly in his younger years, he's a great friend to actors because he tells you often not only how the characters are saying the things that they're saying, but also very usefully what they're thinking while they're saying it, which is often sometimes slightly at odds with each other. His language is just so vibrant, so colourful. His descriptive powers, his sense of humour, his sense of atmosphere and place, so incredibly strong. Yes, I think some of the accusations that are levelled at him and have been levelled at him over the years, that his characters lack psychological depth and that he has a tendency to sentimentality. I think I would say to some extent guilty on both charges, but the characters he created have survived the test of time beyond any question and continue to hold a fascination for us today. Indeed, just this year, the year that I'm recording this, which is towards the end of 2020, we've had a new addition to the canon with Armando Iannucci's adaptation of David Copperfield. Well, A Christmas Carol was published almost exactly 177 years ago to the day, just a few days on from where I'm recording this now. It was published in 1843. Dickens was only 31 at the time, which will seem young. And yet, in addition to his career as a journalist, if you remember, he particularly made his name as a parliamentary sketch writer covering debates in the House of Commons. He had already written and published Pickwick Papers, Oliver Twist, Nicholas Nickleby, The Old Curiosity Shop, and Barnaby Rudge. And he had, in the year before writing and publishing A Christmas Carol, made his first visit to the United States. So, A Christmas Carol was published on the 19th of December, and it had sold out by Christmas Eve and ran through 13 editions in the following year alone. And such was the popularity of it, and Dickens himself so much in demand, that he began to give public readings of the story in abridged versions. And it's stated that he gave 127 of these public readings of A Christmas Carol, the last coming in the year of his death, which was 1870. Now, we associate A Christmas Carol, of course, with Christmas, quite rightly so. Um, and yet, the principal motivation for Dickens was not specifically Christmas. It was, in his own words, his desire to take a sledgehammer to the conditions of the poor, the working class poor in general, and in particular, poor working class children. At a time when, of course, there was no kind of social security at all, and it was said that in particular, it was visits to the Field Lane Ragged School, as it was called in London, and also a visit to Manchester, a field trip to see for himself the condition of the working class in particularly in mill towns around Manchester, which was the impetus for his novel Hard Times, that gave rise to the writing of the story. And Dickens was tremendously emotionally invested in that aspect of the story. He's described as weeping, laughing, and weeping again while he wrote it. And Dickens talked himself of walking 15 to 20 miles a night through, as he put it, the black streets of London, while he was working on the story. But it is the the celebration of Christmas that it's come to be associated with, and indeed the phrase "Merry Christmas," which is repeated so often through the story. Dickens is credited with the popularizing of that phrase, although I believe it was common in use as early as the mid 16th century. And contrary to what some people will try to tell you, although I am a non believer myself, I have never observed the wishing and the receiving of the wishes for a Merry Christmas to have ever gone out of fashion. I've been doing so all my life, and I expect to do so again this year. Certainly, Dickens was responding to what was an increasing popularity of Christmas in these early Victorian years. It's worth remembering, I think, that we stand or sit here 180 years on from the writing and publication of A Christmas Carol, 180 years prior to A Christmas Carol. It's worth remembering in the mid 17th century in England, the celebration of Christmas was banned by the Puritans. So there was a resurgence in popularity and love and rediscovery of Christmas itself, though it's often observed that the the festival, as Dickens puts it forward in A Christmas Carol, is perhaps more secular than religious. I think it's a little bit of both, but anyway, that's background to A Christmas Carol. It has continued in its popularity unabated. I mean, I grew up, I think, knowing best of all the film version starring Alistair Sim as Ebenezer Scrooge, and I remember also 1971 the BBC showed a wonderful. It's very short, 25 minutes long, animated version of A Christmas Carol, animated and directed by Richard Williams, who became famous as being responsible for the animation in Who Framed Roger Rabbit, and you can find that on YouTube. I recommend looking for it. It's although, as I say, it's very, very abridged. It's narrated by Michael Redgrave, and again, it has the voice of Alistair Sim as Scrooge. There was, of course, Scrooge the musical, put on film with Albert Finney in the role of Scrooge. Patrick Stewart performed his own one-man show of A Christmas Carol, and I've always understood, and I hope it's true, that it was when Gene Roddenberry, the creator of Star Trek, um, attended a performance of A Christmas Carol that he realized he had found his Jean-Luc Picard. Um, uh, and unabashedly and unashamedly, I will also say that, without question, one of my favourite adaptations of A Christmas Carol, and I think one of the most successful and true to the original spirit in a lot of ways, was the version starring Michael Caine and a host of the Muppets Christmas Carol. So that's by way of introduction. So I'll move now on to the story itself, and I will preface it with the brief preface that Dickens himself wrote. Dickens, by the way, divided his story into 5 staves, which is a strangely musical subdivision to give. I'm going to serialize this in 8 parts, so I'm not precisely going to follow the separation of Dickens' story. And I will just add again, as I always do, that this is live as I'm recording it. It won't be when you see it, of course. But there will be no edits and retakes, and if mistakes are made, I will just have to deal with them. So the preface that Dickens wrote, he said, "I have endeavoured, in this ghostly little book, to raise the ghost of an idea, which shall not put my readers out of humour with themselves, with each other, with the season, or with me. May it haunt their houses pleasantly, and no one wish to lay it. Their faithful friend and servant, C.D., December 1843. And so, in December 2020, part 1 of A Christmas Carol by Charles Dickens. Marley was dead, to begin with. There is no doubt whatever about that. The register of the burial was signed by the clergyman, the clerk, the undertaker, and the chief mourner. Scrooge signed it, and Scrooge's name was good upon change for anything he chose to put his hand to. Old Marley was dead as a doornail. Mind, I don't mean to say that I know of my own knowledge what there is particularly dead about a doornail. I might have been inclined myself to regard a coffin nail as the deadest piece of ironmongery in the trade, but the wisdom of our ancestors is in the simile, and my unhallowed hands shall not disturb it, or the country's done for. You will therefore permit me to repeat emphatically that Marley was as dead as a doornail. Scrooge knew he was dead? Oh, of course he did. How could it be otherwise? Scrooge and he were partners for, I don't know how many years. Scrooge was his sole executor, his sole administrator, his sole assign, his sole residuary legatee, his sole friend, and sole mourner. And even Scrooge was not so dreadfully cut up by the sad event, but that he was an excellent man of business on the very day of the funeral, and solemnized it with an undoubted bargain. The mention of Marley's funeral brings me back to the point I started from. There is no doubt that Marley was dead. This must be distinctly understood, or nothing wonderful can come out of the story I am going to relate. If we were not perfectly convinced that Hamlet's father died before the play began, there would be nothing more remarkable in his taking a stroll at night in an easterly wind upon his own ramparts than there would be in a breezy spot, say St. Paul's churchyard, for instance, literally to astonish his weak son's mind. Scrooge never painted out old Marley's name. There it stood, years afterward, above the warehouse door. Scrooge and Marley. The firm was known as Scrooge and Marley. Sometimes people new to the business called Scrooge Scrooge, and sometimes Marley, but he answered to both names. It was all the same to him. Oh, but he was a tight-handed fist at the grindstone, Scrooge. A squeezing, wrenching, grasping, scraping, clutching, covetous old sinner. Hard and sharp as flint, from which no steel ever struck out generous fire. Secret and self-contained and solitary as an oyster. The cold within him froze his features, nipped his pointed nose, shrivelled his cheek, stiffened his gait, made his eyes red, his thin lips blue, and spoke out shrewdly in his grating voice. A frosty rime was on his head and on his eyebrows and his wiry chin. He carried his own low temperature about with him always. He iced his office in the dog days and didn't thaw it 1 degree at Christmas. External heat and cold had little influence on Scrooge. No warmth could warm, no wintry weather chill him. No wind that blew was bitterer than he. No falling snow was more intent upon its purpose, no pelting rain less open to entreaty. Foul weather didn't know where to have him. The heaviest rain and snow and hail and sleet could boast of the advantage over him in only one respect. They often came down handsomely, and Scrooge never did. Nobody ever stopped him in the street to say with gladsome looks, "My dear Scrooge, how are you? When will you come to see me?" No beggars implored him to bestow a trifle. No children asked him what it was o'clock. No man or woman ever once in all his life inquired the way to such and such a place of Scrooge. Even the blind men's dogs appeared to know him, and when they saw him coming on, would tug their owners into doorways and up courts, and then would wag their tails as though they said, "No eye at all is better than an evil eye, dark master." But what did Scrooge care? It was the very thing he liked. To edge his way along the crowded paths of life, warning all human sympathy to keep its distance, was what the knowing ones call nuts to Scrooge. Once upon a time, of all the good days in the year, on Christmas Eve, old Scrooge sat busy in his counting-house. It was cold, bleak, biting weather, foggy withal, and he could hear the people in the court outside go wheezing up and down, beating their hands upon their breasts and stamping their feet upon the pavement stones to warm them. The city clocks had only just gone 3, but it was quite dark already. It had not been light all day, and candles were flaring in the windows of the neighbouring offices like ruddy smears upon the palpable brown air. The fog came pouring in at every chink and keyhole, and was so dense without that although the court was of the narrowest, the houses opposite were mere phantoms. To see the dingy cloud come drooping down, obscuring everything, one might have thought that nature lived hard by and was brewing on a large scale. The door of Scrooge's counting-house was open, that he might keep his eye upon his clerk, who in a dismal little cell beyond, a sort of tank, was copying letters. Scrooge had a very small fire, but the clerk's fire was so very much smaller that it looked like 1 coal. But he couldn't replenish it, for Scrooge kept the coal box in his own room, and so surely as the clerk came in with the shovel, the master predicted that it would be necessary for them to part. Wherefore the clerk put on his white comforter and tried to warm himself at the candle, in which effort, not being a man of strong imagination, he failed. "A Merry Christmas, Uncle! God save you!" cried a cheerful voice. It was the voice of Scrooge's nephew, who came upon him so quickly that this was the first intimation he had of his approach. "Ah," said Scrooge, "humbug." He had so heated himself with rapid walking in the fog and frost, this nephew of Scrooge's, that he was all in a glow. His face was ruddy and handsome, his eyes sparkled, and his breath smoked again. "Christmas a humbug?" said Scrooge's nephew. "You don't mean that, I am sure." "I do," said Scrooge. "Merry Christmas! What right have you to be merry? What reason have you to be merry? You're poor enough." "Oh, come then," returned the nephew gaily. "What right have you to be dismal? What reason have you to be morose? You're rich enough." Scrooge, having no better answer ready on the spur of the moment, said "Ah" again, and followed it up with "humbug." "Oh, don't be cross, uncle," said the nephew. "What else can I be," returned the uncle, "when I live in such a world of fools as this? Merry Christmas? Out upon Merry Christmas! What's Christmas time to you but a time for paying bills without money? A time for finding yourself a year older and not an hour richer, a time for balancing your books and having every item in 'em through a round dozen of months presented dead against you." "If I could work my will," said Scrooge indignantly, "every idiot who goes about with Merry Christmas on his lips should be boiled with his own pudding and buried with a stake of holly through his heart. So he should." "Oh, uncle," pleaded the nephew. "Nephew," returned the uncle sternly, "keep Christmas in your own way, and let me keep it in mine." "Keep it?" repeated Scrooge's nephew. "But you don't keep it." "Let me leave it alone, then," said Scrooge. "Much good may it do you. Much good has it ever done you." "Oh, there are many things from which I might have derived good, by which I have not profited, I dare say," returned the nephew. "Christmas among the rest. But I am sure I have always thought of Christmas time, when it has come around, apart from the veneration due to its sacred name and origin, if anything belonging to it can be apart from that, as a good time. A kind, forgiving, charitable, pleasant time. The only time I know of in the long calendar of the year when men and women seem by one consent to open their shut-up hearts freely, and to think of people below them as if they really were fellow passengers to the grave, and not another race of creatures bound on other journeys. And therefore, uncle, though it has never put a scrap of gold or silver in my pocket, I believe that it has done me good, and will do me good, and I say, God bless it." The clerk in the tank involuntarily applauded. Becoming immediately sensible of the impropriety, he poked the fire, and extinguished the last frail spark for ever. "Let me hear another sound from you," said Scrooge, "and you'll keep your Christmas by losing your situation. You're quite a powerful speaker, sir," he added, turning to his nephew. "No wonder you don't go into Parliament." "Oh, don't be angry, uncle. Come, dine with us tomorrow." Scrooge said that he would see him in hell. Yes, indeed he did. He went the whole length of the expression, and said that he would see him in that extremity first. "But why?" said Scrooge's nephew. "Why?" "Why did you get married?" said Scrooge. "Well, because I fell in love." "Because you fell in love," growled Scrooge, as if that were the only thing in the world more ridiculous than a Merry Christmas. "Good afternoon." "Nay, uncle, but you never came to see me before that happened. Why give it as a reason for not coming now?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I want nothing from you. I ask nothing of you. Why cannot we be friends?" "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "I am sorry with all my heart to find you so resolute. We have never had any quarrel to which I have been a party, but I have made the trial in homage to Christmas, and I'll keep my Christmas humour to the last. So, a Merry Christmas, uncle." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. "And a Happy New Year." "Good afternoon," said Scrooge. His nephew left the room without an angry word, notwithstanding. He stopped at the outer door to bestow the greetings of the season on the clerk, who, cold as he was warmer than Scrooge, for he returned them cordially. "There's another fellow," muttered Scrooge, who overheard him. "My clerk, with 15 shillings a week, and a wife and family, talking about a Merry Christmas. I'll retire to Bedlam." The lunatic, in letting Scrooge's nephew out, had let 2 other people in. They were portly gentlemen, pleasant to behold, and now stood with their hats off in Scrooge's office. They had books and papers in their hands, and bowed to him. "Scrooge and Marley's, I believe," said one of the gentlemen, referring to his list. "Have I the pleasure of addressing Mr. Scrooge or Mr. Marley?" "Mr. Marley has been dead these 7 years," Scrooge replied. "He died 7 years ago this very night." "We have no doubt his liberality is well represented by his surviving partner," said the gentleman, presenting his credentials. It certainly was, for they had been 2 kindred spirits. At the ominous word liberality, Scrooge frowned and shook his head and handed the credentials back. "At this festive season of the year, Mr. Scrooge," said the gentleman, taking up a pen, "it is more than usually desirable that we should make some slight provision for the poor and destitute, who suffer greatly at the present time. Many thousands are in want of common necessaries. Hundreds of thousands are in want of common comforts, sir." "Are there no prisons?" asked Scrooge. "Plenty of prisons," said the gentleman, laying down the pen again. "Then the Union workhouses?" demanded Scrooge. "Are they still in operation?" "They are, still," returned the gentleman. "I wish I could say they were not." "The treadmill and the poor law are in full vigour, then?" said Scrooge. "Both very busy, sir." "Oh! Well, I was afraid, from what you said at first, that something had occurred to stop them in their useful course," said Scrooge. "I am very glad to hear it." "Under the impression that they scarcely furnish Christian cheer of mind or body to the multitude," returned the gentleman, "a few of us are endeavouring to raise a fund to buy the poor some meat and drink and means of warmth. We choose this time because it is a time of all others when want is keenly felt and abundance rejoices. What shall I put you down for?" "Nothing," Scrooge replied. "You wish to be anonymous?" "I wish to be left alone," said Scrooge. "Since you ask me what I wish, gentlemen, that is my answer. I don't make merry myself at Christmas, and I can't afford to make idle people merry. I help to support the establishments I have mentioned. They cost enough, and those who are badly off must go there." "Many can't go there, and many would rather die." "If they would rather die," said Scrooge, "they had better do it, and decrease the surplus population. Besides, excuse me, I don't know that." "But you might know it," observed the gentleman. "It's not my business," Scrooge returned. "It's enough for a man to understand his own business, and not to interfere with other people's. Mine occupies me constantly. Good afternoon, gentlemen." Seeing clearly that it would be useless to pursue their point, the gentleman withdrew. Scrooge resumed his labours with an improved opinion of himself, and in a more facetious temper than was usual with him. Meanwhile the fog and darkness thickened so that people ran about with flaring links, proffering their services to go before horses in carriages and conduct them on their way. The ancient tower of a church, whose gruff old bell was always peeping slyly down at Scrooge out of a Gothic window in the wall, became invisible, and struck the hours and quarters in the clouds with tremulous vibrations afterwards, as if its teeth were chattering in its frozen head up there. The cold became intense. In the main street, at the corner of the court, Some labourers were repairing the gas pipes and had lighted a great fire in a brazier, round which a party of ragged men and boys were gathered, warming their hands and winking their eyes before the blaze in rapture. The water plug being left in solitude, its overflowings suddenly congealed and turned to misanthropic ice. The brightness of the shops, where holly sprigs and berries crackled in the lamp heat of the windows, made pale faces ruddy as they passed. Poulterers' and grocers' trades became a splendid joke, a glorious pageant, with which it was next to impossible to believe that such dull principles as bargain and sale had anything to do. The Lord Mayor, in the stronghold of the mighty mansion house, gave orders to his 50 cooks and butlers to keep Christmas as a Lord Mayor's household should, and even the little tailor, whom he had fined 5 shillings on the previous Monday for being drunk and bloodthirsty in the streets, stirred up tomorrow's pudding in his garret, while his lean wife and the baby sallied out to buy the beef. Foggier yet, and colder, piercing, searching, biting cold. If the good St. Dunstan had but nipped the evil spirit's nose with a touch of such weather as that, instead of using his familiar weapons, then indeed he would have roared to lusty purpose. The owner of one scant young nose, gnawed and mumbled by the hungry cold, as bones are gnawed by dogs, stooped down at Scrooge's keyhole to regale him with a Christmas carol. But at the first sound of "God bless you, merry gentlemen, may nothing you dismay," Scrooge seized the ruler with such energy of action that the singer fled in terror, leaving the keyhole to the fog and even more congenial frost. At length the hour of shutting up the counting-house arrived. With an ill will, Scrooge dismounted from his stool, and tacitly admitted the fact to the expectant clerk in the tank, who instantly snuffed his candle out and put on his hat. "You'll want all day tomorrow, I suppose," said Scrooge. If quite convenient, sir." "It's not convenient," said Scrooge, "and it's not fair. If I was to stop half a crown for it, you'd think yourself ill-used, I'll be bound." The clerk smiled faintly. "And yet," said Scrooge, "you don't think me ill-used when I pay a day's wages for no work?" The clerk observed that it was only once a year. "A poor excuse for picking a man's pocket every 25th of December," said Scrooge, buttoning his greatcoat to the chin. "But I suppose you must have the whole day. Be here all the earlier the next morning." The clerk promised that he would, and Scrooge walked out with a growl. The office was closed in a twinkling, and the clerk, with the long ends of his white comforter dangling below his waist, for he boasted no greatcoat, went down a slide on Cornhill at the end of a lane of boys 20 times in honour of its being Christmas Eve, and then ran home to Camden Town as hard as he could pelt, to play at blindman's buff. And with Scrooge's clerk, Bob Cratchit, playing blindman's buff at home, I'll leave that there at the end of part 1 of A Christmas Carol. Thank you for watching, and thank you for listening.